Hello, and welcome to our first fall 2021 Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College Brown Bag Lecture. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. My name is Charlotte Enns, and I am the director of the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice here at St. Paul's College, and I'm also a professor in the Faculty of Education. I'm going to give a little bit of background, a little bit of information about how we'll run the session today, and then we'll get to meet our speaker. So I just want to say that the Morrow Institute was founded as the Morrow Center some 20 years ago under the direction of the founding director and co-directors, Dr. Sean Byrne and Dr. Jessica Senehi. And the Morrow Institute and St. Paul's College served as the driving force in the establishment of the PACS, the Peace and Conflict Studies, PhD program in 2007. And this fall, the Morrow Institute is pleased to continue to shine the spotlight on the alumni of the University of Manitoba's PhD program in Peace and Conflict Studies. We are especially pleased to be able to have all three co-editors alumni of the PACS PhD program, and they'll all be offering Brown Bag Lecture Series this fall. I'm not sure if I froze up there. I got a message. My internet was unstable, as can happen. But again, I'll just say that we're very pleased to have the three of the editors from the research from the Morrow Institute book series. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Katerina Standish, who I will introduce in a few moments. And then in the coming weeks, Dr. Laura Reimer and Dr. Chuck Thiessen will also join us for their own Brown Bag lectures. The first two volumes of the book series, Conflict Transformation, Peace Building and Storytelling, published September 2018, and Expanding the Edges of Narrative Inquiry, published in November 2019, are published by Lexington Books and are available from Rowan and Littlefield. Links to both books can be found on the Morrow Institute website and on the page for the Brown Bag Lectures. So please note that today's lecture is being recorded and will be available on the Morrow Institute's YouTube channel in the coming days. A link to the lecture will also be added to the Morrow Institute's Brown Bag Lecture webpage. After this welcome and introduction, Dr. Standish will offer her lecture, Gendercide, which will be followed by question and answer period. Maybe some of you have tried to make this transition to the new University of Manitoba Zoom platform. It hasn't been without its challenges, but it does offer a very secure site. So we have done that. So for today's lecture, it's our first try at a public lecture in this new format. And some of the limitations that we're going to try to overcome in future lectures, we haven't really managed to do. So for today, we're asking you to ask questions by typing your questions in the chat and directing them to the person or host that's named questions, okay? And you'll see that listed there as one of the participants that you can send a message to. And then those questions will be relayed to the lecturer, to Dr. Standish, and maybe we can experiment with letting some of you unmute yourselves and ask questions, but we're just going to see how that goes. Jason Brennan, our manager and all things logistical, is behind the scenes working all of this, and hopefully we can figure out ways to do that. So we do like to, because as you know, these brown bags are usually a more of a community, a sharing, and we get to know each other a bit. And it's a little bit difficult to do that in this format, but we'll see what we can do. Okay, with no further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Katerina Standish to the Brown Bag Lecture today. So let's see if we can see you there. Can you get your camera and mic on, Katerina?
Hi, here I am.
Wonderful, welcome. And where are you coming to us from today?
I'm actually in the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is in the South Pacific. And I am in a city called Dunedin and in my house because it's Saturday morning here.
Of course, thank you for doing this on a Saturday. We appreciate that. And you are currently working as a senior lecturer there at which university is it?
It's actually the oldest university in the country, and it's called the University of Otaga. And there are 3 campuses, but I'm on the Dunedin one, which is the oldest one.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I'm now going to, in addition to Katerina being a senior lecturer there at the University of Otago, she is also sits on many editorial boards. And well, we know she's an editor for the Morrow Institute book series, but also an editor for a number of journals, and is a member of numerous professional and research organizations. Dr. Standish holds a doctoral degree in peace and conflict studies from here, the University of Manitoba, a master's degree in human security and peace building from Royal Roads University, and a post-baccalaureate in communications from Simon Fraser University, an undergraduate degree in sociology, anthropology, and humanities from Simon Fraser University, and is currently completing a master's in Indigenous studies from the University of Otago. So no shortage of learning going on. Dr. Standish is a specialist in transformative education, a scholar of suicide, a local and international scholar practitioner working at the intersection of well-being and peace building, creator of the Theory and Practice Manual for Emotional Regulation and Violence Prevention, a Hope curriculum educator, the inventor and primary researcher for the Peace Education Curriculum Analysis Project, and senior editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Positive Peace. Dr. Standish's peace practices include working in partnership with local communities in Canada and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and with international teams in global peacebuilding research and practice. She has experience in peacebuilding in Uganda, Palestine, Israel, and with the Red Cross in Canada and New Zealand. She has been a health and well-being practitioner for over 20 years and specializes in teaching wellness, contemplative learning practices, and personal violence transformation. And so, with no further ado, let's hear from Dr. Standish and her topic for today, gendercide. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that wonderful introduction. I do sound good on paper. It's amazing. So I'm going to share my screen and begin my presentation. Let's see if I can manage this. Okay, I think I'm sharing. I think this looks like it's working.
Yep, it looks
Terrific.
good. Looks
Thank you
good.
so much for confirming. Okay, terrific. So as Professor Enns mentioned, my name's Katerina Standish. I am a Canadian peace educator, currently working at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies here down at the University of Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am a social scientist and content analyst. I research cultural, structural, and direct forms of deliberate harm, such as discrimination, suicide, and gendered violence, but also hope curricula and decolonization, education for human rights, and peace pedagogy. I am the editor-in-chief of the Peace Review, Journal of Social Justice, and senior editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Positive Peace, as Charlotte mentioned. So I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of the Brown Bag Lunch Online for inviting a Morrow graduate in Peace and Conflict Studies to give back to the Manitoba community, and for all of you who elected to watch me either in real time or online instead of the dogs of TikTok, which I know is a huge attraction. So in this Brown Bag afternoon edition today, I'd like to present Gendercide. I'm going to begin by rooting the phenomena of gendercide and genocide. I'll then define gender-based violence, offer a discourse of gendercide, and then illuminate 7 incarnations of gendercide, including androcide, transicide, queericide, femicide, Indigenous gendercide, feticide, and infanticide. I'd like to begin with a quote from anthropologist Nancy Shepherd-Hughes from Power in the Self. There are types of everyday life and everyday practice that participate in sanctioning genocidal-like behaviors towards certain gens, classes of people who are seen as disposable. Nothing I say here has not already been said before. We're going to speak today of troubling and difficult knowledge. The goal of this presentation is to inform and elevate our understanding of a subject that is deeply dehumanizing, harmful, and traumatic. The subject is dehumanizing because gendercidal violence turns people into things denied the rights, freedom from harm, and dignity they deserve. It's harmful not only because of the psychological and physical aggressions endured, but because of the grave scars the acts leave on victims, bystanders, and perpetrators alike. And it is traumatic because traumatic experiences emerge from a fundamental inability to secure safety, autonomy, and control over your life. We're not here to talk about democratic values or cryptocurrency or other things that can be appreciated intellectually. Gendercide is something that affects all of us and overwhelmingly continues to be obscured, concealed, unseen, and ignored. My goal in this talk is not to harm you, but to stimulate your awareness and recruit your compassion. That said, I humbly ask you all to utilize responsible self-care if this material becomes unbearable. Step 1, eyes down. Step 2, ears closed. Step 3, leave the room or Zoom or mute it. And step 4 is to breathe. Big breath in and big breath out. Come back if you like, or enjoy the dogs of TikTok. Onward. So genocide was first coined by Raphael Lemkin, who considered genocide violence motivated by the identity of the victims, including killing group members, causing serious bodily or mental harm, intentional actions that destroy people's cultures and dissolve communities, and deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. His work was pivotal in the post-World War II establishment of genocide theory. Much of Lemkin's original concept was codified into Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, or the Genocide Convention, to conclude that genocide includes any one of the following: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Today, we're going to examine genocide as a form of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence has many forms, but can be differentiated into 6 categories: violence against women and girls, violence against gender and sexually diverse people, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, and structural, also called indirect violence. We don't have time today to get into the cultural roots of gender-based violence, or GBV, but today we're going to focus on the part of the iceberg that we can see. So now that we have a baseline appreciation of genocide theory and we're starting to glimpse gender-based violence, or GBV, in order to examine gendercide, or gendered genocide, we need more than descriptions of gender-based violence. We actually need a definition. I like the United Nations definition here. The United Nations defines gender-based violence as violence directed against a person or a group of persons on the basis of their gender or sex. They include in their definition physical, mental, or sexual harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion, and other deprivations of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. I like this definition because instead of simply characterizing or categorizing incarnations of violence, it gets to the roots of why these forms of violence occur, these forms of violence that occur on the basis of someone's gender or sex. Okay, so where does the word gendercide come from? In the late 70s, Mary Daly, in her book Gynecology, The Metaethics of Radical Feminism, termed the everyday killing of women and girls as gynocide. And she included in her definition forms of violence against females, such as child marriage, witch burning, female genital mutilation, foot binding, and Western medical sado-ritualization of the female body, which she termed gynecological gynocide. But a few years later, in Gendercide, The Implications of Sex Selection, Marianne Warren coined the sex-neutral term gendercide to include male victims as well. Warren wrote that the term gendercide calls attention to the fact that gender roles have often had lethal consequences, and that these are in important respects analogous to the lethal consequences of racial, religious, and class prejudice. Canadian genocide scholar Adam Jones later differentiated forms of gendercide into a sex binary that included either genocidal violence against males, androcide, or females, femicide. So if you're like me, you might be wondering by now, when gender-based violence seems to harmonize with the definition of genocide, we don't automatically include gender in the definition of genocide or automatically gender genocide. We can examine gendercide along the lines of 5 core facets: identity, group and self-concept, direct or physical violence, tangible or threatened, psychological violence, tangible or threatened, oppressive violence, tyranny and persecution, and life diminishment, repressive violence and denial of resources and needs. As we've seen, the UNHCR definition from a few slides ago, GBV includes violence based on gender or sex, violence that causes physical, mental, and situated harm that results in personal autonomy and freedom. And as we can see from Lemkin's definition of genocide and the Genocide Convention, the 2 right-hand columns of the table, facets 2 to 5 are congruent with the UNHRC GBV definition as well. The only variable that varies is the encapsulation of identity factors included in the act of harm. The Genocide Convention only lists 4 possible identity groups, those cohered by national, ethnical, racial, or religious qualities. So why does the Genocide Convention erase sex and gender? We can see here that groups identified in the convention included national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. Is it possible the nations who created and signed the Genocide Convention chose this because they didn't consider violence against people based on gender or sex illegitimate? Is it possible the Genocide Convention isn't really about stopping lethal identity-based violence, but stopping lethal identity-based violence against gender-conforming males? And today, with the inclusion of everyday gender-based violence, mean that genocide, instead of being something extraordinary, was actually a constant human feature of all nations, cultures, and contexts. Because if we add gender to genocide, It is not special or unique. It is everywhere. Now, in this brown bag lecture, I'm going to illuminate 7 forms of gendercide. Please be mindful of your well-being in this content and practice responsible self-care. We are going to begin with androcide, the deliberate killing of males. Canadian genocide scholar Adam Jones sought to counter the academic presumption that women and girls were the main victims of gender-based violence and found evidence that in situations of war and genocide, non-combatant men were the main targets of gender-based violence. The most vulnerable and consistently targeted population group in situations of war and genocide, through time and around the world today, is non-combatant men of battle age, roughly 15 to 55 years old. They are universally perceived as the group posing the greatest danger to the conquering force and are the group most likely to have the repressive apparatus of the state directed against them. The non-combatant distinction is also vital. These men have no means of defending themselves and can be detained and exterminated by the thousands or millions. His findings were echoed in Josh Goldstein's opus, War and Gender. In July 1995, during the Bosnian War, more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys, non-combatant males, were killed in what's called the Srebrenica genocide, massacre, or the Bosnian genocide. Unarmed prisoners were detained in empty schools or warehouses, then taken in batches to an execution site. Steps were taken to minimize resistance, such as blindfolding them, binding their wrists behind their backs with ligatures, or removing their shoes. Once at the killing fields, the men were taken off the trucks in small groups, lined up, and shot. This is the Genocide Memorial in Srebrenica, Puričari. Transicide is the killing of trans people. Those who perpetuate violence against trans population often target gender nonconformity, gender expression or identity, and perceived sexual orientation. Headlines from just the last couple of years signal a chilling uptake of violence against trans people, with the first 6 months of 2021 considered to be the deadliest yet. Corrective rape, also called curative or homophobic rape, or queericide, is a hate crime with the intention of converting lesbians to heterosexuality. Corrective rape is a practice where lesbian women are raped by men, sometimes under supervision of or mandated by members of their families or local communities, reportedly as a means of curing them of their gayness, boy-like behavior, or homosexuality. This is a practice that has been found prevalent in 14 countries thus far, including South Africa, Ecuador, Haiti, India, Jamaica, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Peru, Thailand, Uganda, the Ukraine, the United Kingdom, the US, and Zimbabwe. The term femicide was coined in 1976 at the first International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women, originally used to gender homicide, a neutral term that obscures the identity of both perpetrator and victim. Femicide refers to the death of females as a legitimized form of social order. Femicide is the misogynist killing of women by men, motivated by hatred, contempt, pleasure, or a sense of ownership of women. As femicide scholar Professor Shalva Weil fervently intones, while more men are killed than women, they are not murdered because they are men. UN Women alert us that, dissimilar to other forms of male-perpetrated and experienced violence, femicidal violence tends to be enacted in private, perpetrated by domestic partners or past partners and family members. Femicide not only includes the killing of females before and throughout the life cycle, but also the deprivation of human rights, including the life-enhancing necessities of health, personal autonomy, social assistance, and security. An incomplete, though significant, list of forms of femicide would include intimate femicide, coercion, life diminishment, and the killing of women by partners or ex-partners, 1 in every 2 females killed is by an intimate, and 93% of those killed by an intimate femicide are killed by a former or current lover. The point is, most women are not killed by strangers, but by people they know, trust, and often love. Honor femicide, the killing of a female family member in response to a perceived transgression and conducted to restore family honor. Dowry femicide, the killing of a newly married woman for bringing an insufficient dowry to a marriage. Non-intimate or sexual femicide, the rape and killing of women by non-intimate partners. Infection femicide, females who are deliberately infected with illnesses such as HIV or herpes. Public misogynist attacks, violent spectacle assaults such as recent incel attacks. Female geronticide, the killing of elderly females by their partners. Femicidal mutilation, also known as female genital mutilation or female cutting, which affects 200+ million females in 30 countries. Female human trafficking, the kidnapping, forced movement, confinement, labor, and sexual slavery of females. Disabled femicide, the abuse and killing of disabled females. And gynecological femicide, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, unnecessary hysterectomies, and hysteria psychosurgery. Femicidal violence exists all over the globe. The legal subordination of females, acceptance and erasure of violence against them, misogynistic cultural practices, structural inequality, and the widespread dehumanization of females makes femicidal violence legitimate, permissible, and pervasive. While Goldstein and Jones consider androcidal violence to be the most prevalent form of gendercide during conflict, without doubt, femicidal violence, because it exists at any point in the conflict spectrum, including during so-called tranquility, is the majority form. The fact that we have a global genocide convention that does not mention sex or gender is testament to the erasure of violence against females worldwide. Contemporary Indigenous gendercide is a continuation of genocidal practices that have targeted Indigenous peoples all over the world. The thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people is testament to the hidden gendercidal violence present in everyday Canada life. The 2019 National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls states, colonial violence as well as racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people has become embedded in everyday life, whether this is through interpersonal forms of violence, through institutions like the healthcare system and the justice system, or in the laws, policies, and structures of Canadian society. The result has been that many Indigenous people have grown up normalized to violence, while Canadian society shows an appalling apathy to addressing the issue. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls finds that this amounts to genocide. Unfortunately, Indigenous gendercide is not new. It is not also confined to the 20th century. Many traditional Native American societies had diverse gender and sexual identities and held intersex, androgynous, gender fluid, trans, and homosexuals in high regard. Two-spirited people included feminine males and masculine females. They were considered spiritually gifted and were often teachers and religious leaders. When Spanish colonists violently settled North America, they imported their homophobic European gender norms. Third gender or two-spirited peoples were cast as sexual or spiritual deviants and were subjected to violent deaths, torture, and humiliation. Spanish soldiers commonly fed the two-spirited to their dogs, and the clergy in Spanish missions often separated two-spirited groups from their communities, forcing them to adopt European masculine or feminine heteronormative social functions. This is gendered Indigenous genocide. The last forms of gendercide I'm going to present today relate to human fertility and the worth of females in society. They're intricately linked and culturally rooted in spiritual, societal, and cultural norms, values, and practices that result in both repressive and oppressive violences. Repression relates to removal of options, actions that limit, reduce, or erase something, whereas oppressive violence involves tyranny and direct persecution. The last two forms of gendercide I will offer in this buffet of horrible are feticide and infanticide. Feticide, the killing of a fetus in utero, also known as sex-selective abortion, and infanticide, the killing of female infants after birth. Feticide and infanticide are sex-neutral terms, but the practice of sex-selective abortion and infant neglect is not seen to affect male fetuses, only female ones. Scholars of South Asia and East Asian cultures suggest that societal son preference, the cost of marriage, dowries for female children, and policies that limit fertility resulted in the abortion of female fetuses once ultrasound technology permitted the sex characteristics of fetuses to be revealed. Scholars have posited that female feticide is linked to female infanticide, a practice where newborn female babies are denied postnatal care or killed. Female feticide is an expedient form of female infanticide, where females are killed before they are born because they are females. Lancet researchers assert that 500,000 female fetuses are killed a year in India, despite the fact that ultrasound sex testing has been outlawed since 1996. And the United Nations Population Fund estimates that globally there are 140 million missing women, reflecting the persistent low status of women and girls globally. Sex-selective abortion is illegal, as is the neglect and killing of female babies. However, these practices remain visible in sex ratio and mortality statistics. The UN Population Fund 2020 report indicated that globally, 1 in 3 girls are missing. Where 61 million girls were missing in 1970, that number is now 142 million. Infant sex ratios are historically and globally remarkably stable. Missing girls are not flukes. They are visible in cultures with son preference, resource gaps, and cultural practices that discriminate against females. They now happen at every technological state of obstetrics and continue postnatally. Gendercidal violence occurs throughout the life cycle, before birth, after, in childhood, youth, adulthood, and in maturity. It happens in developed nations. It happens in places beset by extreme poverty or extreme wealth. It is seen in birth ratios, mortality numbers, assault and homicide statistics. In 1997, after years of seeking to bring the epidemic of traumatic experiences to the fore, Dr. Judith Herman of Harvard Medical School said this: "The study of psychological trauma is an inherently political enterprise because it calls attention to the experience of oppressed people. In 1992, I predicted that our field, the trauma field, would continue to be beset by controversy, no matter how solid its empirical foundation, because the same historical forces that in the past have consigned major discoveries to oblivion continue to operate in the world." She argued that only the ongoing connection with a global political movement for human rights could ultimately sustain our ability to speak of unspeakable things. Gendercide speaks about unspeakable things. If we combine the February 2020 Toronto machete and hammer attacks, 2 people have died of terrorism-related violence in Canada in the last year. Compare that with a recent report that revealed that between 2 to 3 females die a week in Canada. Quick math means over 130 females a year will not only die, they will die violently. This is violence that is being seen to increase globally as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Invisible violence against people in lockdown is being called the shadow pandemic by UN Women. And recent research from July intones that in the background of the global public health and economic turmoil of the COVID-19 pandemic lurks another crisis, a crisis of violence. Dr. Herman said that only a global political movement for human rights could ultimately sustain our ability to address these forms of violence. And there are international campaigns addressing gendercide in human rights instruments. The Declaration of Elimination of Violence Against Women, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Slavery Convention, the Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity, the Forced Labor Convention, the United Nations Principles for Older Persons, and the Convention on Consent to Marriage, Minimum Age. Unfortunately, signing of these international conventions has done very little to eradicate gender-based violence, and much more is needed. Making visible the crimes of gendercide and protecting people legally from these deeply culturally embedded practices of harm is a start, but more nations need to begin to address the scourge of gendercide domestically. In 2017, the Government of Canada instituted a GBV strategy, vowing to fill the gap in support for people experiencing gender-based violence. Their last report was from 2019, and it remains to be seen how such gaps are to be filled. But at least we have an infographic with vision and goals and other information. In my opinion, we also need a dedicated academic unit studying gendercide and gendercidal violence prevention. Dozens of groups and individuals are fighting this fight, and there is increasing levels of dedicated scholarship seeking to make visible these incarnations of preventable violence. As it stands, and by way of comparison, there are literally dozens of higher ed degrees and credentials for people who want to study terrorism. The dedicated study of these forms of interconnected, culturally derived, structurally enabled, and interpersonally employed forms of violence are left to various experts from diverse departments, collectives, and communities. And there are many approaches to this. Some people count victims, other people lobby for legislative changes, some people speak about values and changing the culture of violence. The University of Manitoba rose to the occasion and developed the country's first advanced degrees in peace and conflict studies, the first master's in human rights and social justice. Maybe they'll be the first to develop a center for gendercidal studies too. Finally, I want to say that victims of crime are innocent, whether their harm is perpetrated in public or private. And the purpose of this short talk is not to compare the suffering of a cancer patient to a diabetic. Such things are grotesque comparatives, and they don't serve our greater need to eradicate violence in all its incarnations. We are all connected, and in saving others, we will save ourselves. I hope this talk has inspired your compassion for those who feel that violence sustains them, for those who suffer the consequences of these harms, and for those left to pick up the pieces. We live in very calamitous times, harmful events, whether economic, environmental, or epidemiological. The goal of this lecture has been to draw your attention, however fleetingly, to the reality of violence against people throughout the life cycle because of their sex and because of their gender, and to aver that we should feel ashamed to permit gendercide, compelled to observe the reality of gendercide, or at least be grossly embarrassed to ignore it. Listening is an act of generosity, so I would like to thank you all for your generosity today.
Thank you so much, Katerina, for speaking the unspeakable. As you mentioned, not an easy topic, but I really applaud you for sharing that information so clearly and in such a straightforward manner, and calling us to the task of paying attention to what's happening. We have some time for questions. And so I know I had said initially that people can indicate their questions through the chat to the question chat person. But I also think we have quite a few people here who are known to us in the program. And I would like to give the opportunity, if you have a question, and you'd like to ask it directly to Dr. Standish, if you could raise your hand, then we can allow you to unmute yourselves and ask the question directly if you'd like to do that. So if there's anyone who has a question they want to voice, just indicate with the raise hand reaction there. Okay, I don't see anything. So then we do have a question in the chat for you, Dr. Standish. I'll read it for you. As a Kurd, I want to hear Dr. Standish's view on the genocide of Yazidi girls and women by ISIS, Daesh terror groups. They were enslaved, abducted, and sexually abused because of their faith and ethnic identity. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I wholeheartedly concur. The Yazidi gendercide is absolutely, in my opinion, valid. There is a tendency for people to look at atrocities such as this that happened during conflict as something contained within the theater of discord. But what's happened to Yazidi women, and it's happened to women all over the world. Charlotte Lamb's recent book on women experiences during conflict shows us that this is actually part of the process. So I don't know if the question was, what do I consider the Daesh assault against Yazidi women as a form of gendercide? I absolutely do, without question. Yeah. Can I just say something, Charlotte, just for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just want to reflect that this is an extremely difficult topic. And I think that in many cases, it's not something that people intellectually receive. They may receive it in a much more embodied way. Many of us have experiences of harm ourselves, and we certainly have experiences of harm in our communities, in our cultures, and in our countries. And so if people don't want to speak now, they're more than welcome to email me in their own time with curiosities if they have them, or just to simply observe and reflect on this in terms of their own, personal experience of this information. This is like dropping a boulder in a pond. This content is extremely disturbing, and it's not a pleasure to bring this information forward, but I think it's one of the reasons we don't talk about these issues is because they are so deeply, as you say, speaking of the unspeakable. So I just wanted to reflect back. If people don't have questions, I'm not going to take it as a sign that you aren't engaged or interested. I'm simply going to reflect upon the fact that this is extremely troubling knowledge, and for most of us, it is unsettling.
Thank you for that caution. That's very true. We're just not sure if people are unable to use the reactions. Again, we're testing this new setting. So if any of you have tried to raise your hand, but for whatever reason, we're not seeing it, maybe you can also let the question person know that you have a question, and then maybe we can try and have you speak the question. We'll work that through. I'm assuming right now that there's no one who is trying to raise their hand and I can't see it. But if that is the case, then please do notify the question person. Okay, I do see Tamika Osanami has raised her hand. Did you see that, Jason?
Hello, I just got unmuted, so thank you for the pause. Dr. Standish, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and I appreciate the caution and the consideration, because I'm certainly going to leave here with a lot to reflect on. But I wondered if you could speak a little bit more, because I'm certainly not a scholar of genocide, but when the report came out on the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, and the conclusion was that it was a genocide, I recall that there were some tensions. So I don't know if it was going back to Lemkin's definition, and I know that there's been some thought on that. And given the content today, I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that if you're able to share.
Yes, actually, it's and I'm not a Lemkin scholar, but I do know a little bit about this, and I will have to echo that you're absolutely on the mark. There was a number of conversations regarding the exclusion of various forms of obvious genocides, the experiences of people during slavery in the United States and other nations, and particularly Native peoples all over the world. The idea of claiming the right to have been genocided by survivors is a deeply political endeavor. And it isn't just political because of the need for reconciliation afterward, and in some cases that involves aspects of the courts, etc. But it's also because it talks about a significant failure for people to be considered fully human. And this is certainly a part of our human experiences. I think that the ability to claim your experiences as a form of gendercide is a way of legitimizing your experience of harm. This is the worst crime imaginable. It's one of the reasons why bodies mobilized after the Second World War to create this new category of crime. We already had categories of, homicide or deliberate life diminishing actions. This was considered to be extraordinary. The experiences of Native peoples to be able to say genocide is to be able to say this harm was deliberate. It was something that was experienced because of our identity. It was something that affected us psychologically, physically, and it certainly eradicated the idea of child transfer, which is part of the Genocide Convention. It's all there. You don't need all 5 to be satisfied to be a genocide, but the idea of claiming status as genocide puts into place a number of legal requirements, particularly in states that are signatories to the Genocide Convention. And what we found and what we saw in Bosnia and in Rwanda was that even with all of those different aspects of juridical and international humanitarian law, we still had failure to act, because once you call something a genocide, it requires you to take action. And this is the reason why in 2001, the Canadians were the people on the forefront to create the responsibility to protect doctrine, which said in the event a country has got a genocide within its borders, they are expected to intervene, turning sovereignty from the into a duty to remain in a place where people can be safe. Claiming genocide status is a political act that humanizes the victims and the survivors, and it is resisted. So I think that the idea that it was a genocide or it wasn't a genocide, these are arguments. The people who have experienced it know they were. And those of us who come from cultures that have experienced genocide, we don't actually need the approval of another person, but it is important for it to be recognized. And I think that's, I hope that's an answer to your question. It is contested. There are groups of people who are clearly genocided throughout history and in the present day. Genocides are happening all around us all the time. They are just not afforded that status. Certainly we can talk about, the Rohingya and Myanmar, etc. There are many different places where genocides are happening. We could talk about what's happening against, people, the Uyghur populations in China, etc. There are genocides happening all over the world. It's whether or not they get to claim that status. And there is no perfect victim. There is no perfect victim group. But what happened in our conceptualization of genocide was this particularity, this uniqueness, this extraordinariness, that the Holocaust was a crime of such magnitude. It was singular. It was not echoed in other experiences in human groups. Yet it is, and it is present today, and its presence in all of our nations, in all of our countries. And that's one of the sort of conundrums that we have, is that if we start calling everything genocide, then genocide is everywhere.
Does that answer your question, Tamika? I think we can unmute you again if you have any follow-up or.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. I'd really love it if you could share your contact information with us, because I think there's more, there's so much more, but thank you so much for now.
Should I put it in the chat?
I don't know who can see the chat is my
oh, I see. Okay.
As well. I think it's just us as co-hosts.
You know what?
Yeah, I'd put it in. Maybe people get it.
Thank you, Katerina.
You're welcome.
Jason, sorry, you were going to respond to that?
No, just that we can add it to our website, a link to Katerina's profile page on the University of Otaga. But I think people can see that, so that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Excellent. Is there anyone else with a question? We still do have a few minutes. Sorry, there's a siren behind me here. That's coming through. Sorry about that. I also, if there's no other question, I also wanted to follow up a bit with, it having been our first Truth and Reconciliation, or Day of Truth and Reconciliation yesterday here in Canada, I think was a really important step to acknowledging some of the various forms of genocide or atrocities that have happened in our country, in our history. And, I know that there's some debate about what's a day of awareness, what does that do? Or, is that, how can that be meaningful? So maybe just your thoughts on that, because I think you've talked about the value of getting people to talk about it, but is there more that comes out of some kind of acknowledgement, national acknowledgement like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's part of me feels like we get to these places where we can officially pay our respects to people who have endured harm and people who continue to endure harm, which that recognition is necessary for us to understand and to acknowledge the experiences of the past, but it also changes how we go into the future because we've been educated. I mean, I'm a peace educator, and dealing with difficult knowledge or troubled information or harmful experiences is part of how we work from one place of silence and ignorance into a place where we understand that we can make different choices going forward. I think the need for public recognition, it has to be part of a larger process where education is something that allows us to understand why we're taking a day off work, or why we're sort of saying, well, these people had a problem, but what about these people, etc. It would be nice if we could come together more often. In fact, it's something that people do on a daily basis. In some traditions it's prayer, in some traditions it's sadhana, in some traditions it's the idea of having a gratuity space or understanding our experiences. We're all earthlings, we're all people on this planet, and everything we do and experience affects us and everyone. If there's violence anywhere, there's violence everywhere. So the idea of having a day where we recognize the particular heinous experiences of Indigenous peoples in Canada is absolutely necessary for us to have a conversation and to continue to have that conversation. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has not just allowed people to hand over their experiences, these very painful, traumatic experiences. They've allowed people to start taking responsibility. And these are all very important things. These are not things that are going to get better without more and increased dialogue, in my opinion. We need to have community engagement, and we need to be able to talk about unspeakable things. I remember years ago, the only documentary you could find on what happened in the residential schools was a sort of YouTube video by Kevin Annett on what happened in the United Church in Comox, I think it was in Vancouver Island. And I remember showing it in one of my classes, and it was a absolutely awesome experience because it was witnesses, one after another, giving testimony of their experiences, and it was horrible, and it was absolutely gut-wrenching to watch what these people had experienced. Years later, we have dozens of resources. We have resources that, you know, were geared towards certain age groups, certain community experiences, and certain needs. And this is good. And this is what we need more of. We need this aspect of understanding people carry different burdens, but we can help each other carry one another's burdens. And so this is important, and this elevation is necessary, and I think overall will rehumanize all of us.
Well, that's a good note to end on. And our time is up for today. I really want to thank you for sharing your work and getting us to think about and speak about these topics. I'm sure we'll all leave here with a lot to think about, and you may get some people getting in touch with you for further discussion and ideas. Thank you to everyone who attended today. We really appreciate you being here and being engaged in this important topic. And we ask you to please stay tuned for future brown bag sessions. And again, many thanks to everyone, especially you, Dr. Standish.
My pleasure.
Thank you.